Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. I'm also someone who is 55 years old. I almost said 54. Sometimes I say 56. It's crazy. I'm 55. And I'm someone who's really interested in this idea of women's desire later in life. I think we're having a moment, much in the same way that sort of menopause is having a moment at this point in time in 2025. I like the idea that like older women, which it's like even weird to consider myself in that category, but obviously I'm firmly in that category. But that older women are sort of saying like, hey, we're not going to just be like erased or forgotten or invisible or whatever the thing is. And I've been so happy that there are so many novels that have picked up this thread and really explored this question, in particular of sexual desire among older women. So the first novel that really kind of put this on the map for me was Miranda July's All Fours. There is, of course, a Foxed Page lecture on that from last summer. I loved that book. I loved Miranda July to begin with. Everything about her prose and her attitude just really spoke to me. So I was incredibly happy when she came up with this, great perimenopausal novel. And I was particularly happy about some of the optimism in it, but really happy about the treatment of sexual desire. So then I started kind of paying attention to this thread, and I kept seeing it again and again in media in general. There's so much, maybe this is just my news feed, but there is so much data about menopause these days and so much data about the safety of hormone replacement therapy and a lot of data and a lot of news about how women were just sort of duped with this Women's Health Initiative test that came out, study that came out in the early aughts, and how that shaped, the way that women were prescribed hormone replacement therapy. That's changing. I think a lot of attitudes about menopause are changing. And I've been so happy to see the way that literature has sort of followed suit. And as this is happening, as I'm sort of seeing more and more of this like age gap literature that's coming out, I was sort of hoping that all of it would feel just like Miranda July, that all of it would explore female sexuality and female desire as something that's really empowering and something that's positive and that's reason to be optimistic. And that maybe this closer look at sexual desire of older women would also inflect the way that we look at sexual desire in women in general. I was really thinking this was going to be like a huge boon for feminism in general, beginning, with the older ladies and sort of filtering down. It has been so interesting to read these books. So what exactly am I talking about? Obviously, I'm talking about Sally Rooney's Intermezzo, which is the subject of what we are going to dive into today. I'm also, though, thinking about PLAYWORLD by Adam Ross and about Annie Ernaux's The Younger Man, which is a book that actually came out 25 years ago, but was reissued, which I think is very interesting because it is very germane in this moment of sort of, speaking about women's sexual desire. We're also going to talk about Kate Chopin's The Awakening, which is just an absolute classic, one of these kind of seminal feminist pieces of literature that was literally like written in 1899. It's like one of the OG feminist novels, and it is so fascinating to look at the roots of that and to look at essentially the fate of the woman in The Awakening versus the fate of the protagonist in a book like Miranda July's. And we honestly have sort of everything in between, and I'm so excited about the idea of diving into all of these different books with you all. For those of you on the YouTube, you can see that I'm kind of fumbling with all of these books. A couple of them are really long. Actually, two are really long and one's really short. But I'm interested in the fact that all of these books that are, well, not all of them, but these books, that the three of them that I'm holding that have to do with women's sexual desire are all this kind of same color. They're all this like dark kind of yellow, not dark, it's like a brightish, deep kind of yellow color with some orange. It's a color that I think is really interesting and optimistic and certainly eye-catching. And I'm just noting the fact that there's something happening here with the cover art on all of these books. Today's lecture is going to be a little different. We are going to essentially kick off a little series of these shorter lectures that I'm going to give under this umbrella of sex writing and age gap relationships. So in each one of them, I'm going to take a given novel and do a little bit of analysis about what that novel has to say about this notion of female desire later in life. Of course, we're going to take a look at the prose and stuff, but we're not going to dig quite as deeply in. And one of the things that has been most interesting to me is the way that all of these different books have brought up so many different questions. In some of the lectures, I feel like I'm really imparting, some sort of thesis, or I'm really developing some sort of argument, or I'm, very logically pointing out the ways that a certain piece of literature is exemplary in terms of a social movement or in terms of a literary movement. In this case, it really generated a lot of questions. And my desire, for lack of a better word, was to sort of have this come out in some sort of neat thesis and be able to present all of these books and say, this is what is happening in this moment in 2025, where literature about women's desire is landing. And I was not able to do that, which I think is fine. I think it's fine to be able to explore these things and understand that this is a very heterogeneous group. It has really disparate things to say about the topic, and that's okay. But I wanted to actually begin with this idea of these questions that have arisen. And this might be a little premature, but I do want to look at this series of lectures in terms of the questions that they generate, because I think in some ways that's the most interesting way to think about all of these different books. I then want to talk a little bit about my own biography, because I realized that so many of my assumptions and my reactions really are very personal, in the sense that I have grown up in a very particular, I mean, everyone has in terms of sexuality, like everybody's past and everybody's geographical situation and age and family situation. All of that is so important in terms of informing our attitudes about sex, that it seemed important to sort of lay out some of my biographical information so people have a sense of like where it is that I am coming from. So as I was reading through these books, a bunch of questions arose. One, and first and kind of foremost in some ways, is this question of the double standard. So we have this idea that, you know, like the much older man and the younger woman is like kind of, it's sometimes kind of gross, but it's like very kind of, accepted in society. We have all of these terms, the idea of a trophy wife, the idea of it being very commonplace for men, who are older to sort of divorce their first wives and marry someone who's much, much younger. Annie Ernaux, who we are going to get to, talked so cogently and interestingly in The Younger Man, which we are going to discuss. But it's worth noting here, she said this super smart thing about how when you are in a relationship with someone, in many ways that person is a mirror to you, and certainly as you are aging. So this idea that for these older men, when they're looking at a woman who's older, it is a reminder of the fact that they themselves are aging. And, it's very difficult for a lot of older men to accept aging. I don't think they process it enough. I think, a lot of women, at least the women I know, everyone's talking about aging, whether it be menopause or like our faces or our butts or like whatever the thing is. There's a lot of processing about aging. I feel like men are just kind of more like, just like shocked by the whole thing, or like head in the sand, or whatever the thing is. But she made such an important point that these men, who are looking at these older women and seeing themselves aging, if they suddenly are with someone who's much younger and who is the picture of youth and health and like immortality, then they don't have to face their own aging. I thought that was so smart. But we have this idea that older men and younger women are just kind of, they're kind of fine. But when we have the idea of a much older woman together with a much younger man, it's really sort of shocking in many ways. The fact that I am having, this 4-part, if not 5-part lecture on the topic really says something about the fact that this is unusual. This is not something, that for a long, long time has been an accepted thing, that is totally unremarkable for much older women to be with much younger men. There's obviously a long history of this, but it is always remarkable. We have Colette writing her novels in French about a much older woman and a much younger man. That does not work out very well for her. We're going to look at The Awakening by Kate Chopin, which is, she doesn't say Chopin, that's the French thing, Chopin, who's American, who published The Awakening in 1899. And, things do not go well for Edna in that book. Then we have the idea, of course, of like Mrs. Robinson and The Graduate, which is this cliche about these kind of predatory older women who are after these younger men, but they're very singular. I mean, we have zillions of older men with younger women, but we have like Mrs. Robinson. We have this one kind of iconic figure. There was that whole movement. People talk about it less now, which I think is good. And in some ways, I think that this whole phenomenon was actually like a step forward. But the idea of the cougar, remember back, there was that show with Courtney Cox, Cougar Town. But the idea of cougars was like a total thing for a while. These older women after younger men, obviously hugely predatory. I mean, even just the name. But in some ways, I kind of liked how like carnal that was, and how like it really conferred a lot of power on these women to be like these giant cats. Cats, of course, and felines always being vaguely kind of feminine. But this idea of power, and the idea that like, it wasn't like a great thing to be a cougar, but it also, I think there was a certain amount of like intrigue and esteem, and it became a larger category than just Mrs. Robinson. One last point on this double standard. This was very interesting. When one of my brothers turned 50, We had a big party for him and it was really fun. But one of his very close friends who I'd known forever, who's this amazing therapist, just like an incredible guy, he was there with a woman who was 24. And it was like we all, I talked with her for quite a while. And frankly, I was a little like, I don't know what they talk about together, because she was perfectly nice. I have to say, like, a little vapid. Like, I just was like, who is this young girl? She just has no life experience. Like, what do they talk about? But anyway, we all were like a little intrigued by the fact that this 50-year-old was there with a 24-year-old. But I will hazard to guess that if a 24-year-old young man was there with a 50-year-old woman, it would have been a whole different cultural phenomenon. And I think it's really interesting to do that mental exercise. And I think that's something that we should look at. So a kind of add-on question that arose for me in that regard is like, why is it more shocking to have the older woman? And does it just kind of come down to power? I mean, we all in the United States, certainly, and in most of the world, live in a pretty serious patriarchy. So men have the power. So in some ways, having an older man and a younger woman fits into that idea of the patriarchy. You have someone who's very powerful, who's in control. And, you have someone who is more subservient, someone who has less power, who is sort of in his thrall in some ways. And so then I was questioning how much that kind of, our like, oh my God, like that kind of reaction has to do with the idea that these older women have these younger men in thrall. These older women have a certain amount of power over a man that feels interesting and that feels unusual. I mean, even as I'm saying that, I'm like, why does it seem like she's in control? I think it seems like she's in control because she's older and because there is a certain power that comes with age. We associate youth with naivete and a certain amount of kind of powerlessness in some ways. Although, again, each one of these questions is spawning more and more questions. Which leads me to the next question, which is like, I kept having to think, like, at what point does this become objectionable? Like, how young does the young man have to be in order for me to be like, ooh, wait, that's maybe not great? In PLAYWORLD by Adam Ross, which we are talking to, it is a 14-year-old boy who is having a sexual relationship with a woman who is 36. So a 14-year-old boy, that is an entirely different category than the 22-year-old young man in Sally Rooney's Intermezzo. So it was interesting to me. I mean, is it 18 and 50? I mean, just think about the reaction you're having as I'm saying that. Is it 22 and 36? Is it 22 and 32? Sort of at what point are you like, whoa, wow, wait, that is noteworthy in terms of age gap? Another one of my brothers, when he was 18, was dating someone who was 24 years old. And we all were like, wow, good for them. Like, that's awesome. Good for her. Good for him. Like, that seemed like a super, actually, that was like everybody, well, I'm going to get to my biography, but this is like a fairly permissive household in Northern California. And this was all going on in, the early 90s, I think. But the sentiment there was like an 18-year-old dude with a 24-year-old woman. That seems great for everybody. On that note, I will remind you that in The Awakening by Kate Chopin, the woman is only 2 years older than the man, but it is a decisive 2 years. And I think back even to my own, like when I was in my 20s and people were starting to marry, if a woman was even literally like, I don't know, a year older than a man, that seemed kind of crazy. So to summarize, the question there is like, at what point do these things start to feel kind of predatory or like really not okay versus just remarkable? And why is that the case? And in terms of the men and women and this notion of power, I'm actually interested in this question of like how much of it is simply because men have penises and men are capable of rape and men are capable of violence. I mean, yes, women are capable of violence too, but I think there really is a different sense of vulnerability when you are a woman. This also leads to the question of just the difference between female desire and male desire. I mean, I think we have these like long held ideas about men's desire as being like so much more potent and forceful and like, men's libido and men's like being sort of out of control and so desirous all the time. And I think we've given short shrift to the idea that women have very serious desire. Also, the idea that having sexual relationships with other people can be very empowering for women. I'm very happy to note the ways that the younger generation, I mean, I really do think there is a certain amount of sexual liberation in the sense that, like even the notion of slut shaming, like things have really evolved from this idea that, girls have a reputation if they have many sexual partners and where men are sort of a stud. A lot of that has shifted. And I think we have come to recognize that there is a power for women also in terms of having sexual partners and in terms of like the act of having sex is not only does not confer power only on the man. There's a very powerful sense of, if you're highly desired and if you have a certain power over a man, that in fact can be very empowering. And I'm certainly interested in the question of desire after menopause. Sexual desire on the part of a woman in her 50s is different than sexual desire on the part of a woman in her 20s. But I would argue in many ways that as an older person, you know your body better. You certainly care a lot less about what other people think. There are lots of ways that kind of maturity can lead to a much more fulfilling kind of sex life. And I think, Miranda July made much of the fact that, you're going to go off this hormonal cliff and your desire is going to completely evaporate the minute you go through menopause, and partially because of hormone replacement therapy, but also just because we are really debunking a lot of myths about menopause. We are coming to understand that sexual desire in women is not something that simply evaporates the minute that they stop menstruating. The last question we're going to tackle this week is the idea of how all of this is depicted in all of these different novels. So, this is an ongoing question, and it's obviously sort of the lifeblood of these next few lectures, but it is fascinating the way that people come down so hard in one direction or the other. When I was pulling together the thing on Intermezzo, and also the one for PLAYWORLD, which we will be doing soon, and then the Annie Ernaux one, people really seem to be decisive one way or the other, whether they kind of mean to be or not. It was very satisfying because it seemed very clear to me what these people were thinking. But I'm interested in this larger question of female desire in the media. I was going to include that movie, Baby Girl, but I haven't seen it yet, with Nicole Kidman and the younger guy. I can never remember his name. I think it is fascinating that I always call it Pretty Baby. Remember that movie with Brooke Shields? And she was very, very young, and it was like Louis Malle or somebody. It wasn't him. I can't remember. If you're on the YouTube, I will put the correction there. Maybe it was. Anyway, she essentially played a sex worker, and it was hugely controversial because we really saw, this very, very young girl being taken advantage of by a much older man. That idea, it's interesting to me, the kind of resonance between Pretty Baby and Baby Girl. Very, very different looks at this idea of sexuality and age gaps. Okay, we're going to move on to a quick but very important, I think, bio of me so that you have a sense of the point from which I am discussing all of these things. I was born in 1969 in Northern California. I had parents who were not particularly affectionate, and we're certainly not very sexualized. I think they're in the 70s. There was a lot of parents in the hot tub nude. And actually, wait, what am I saying? There was a lot of nudity around, mostly of women, which is notable. In my childhood, a lot of naked people in the hot tub and naked people in the swimming pool. So there was certainly a lot of nudity. I did not see my parents naked a lot. And again, not a lot of physical affection. We also, I, along with many people in the 70s and 80s, grew up with a lot of neglect. And I say neglect because I really do believe it was neglect. But I also think that there was an enormous amount of freedom. There's been a lot of thinking on this. And in many ways, that freedom really worked to my advantage. I had a father also who was literally not protective at all. I have a sister, and he absolutely trusted us to make good decisions. I don't think anybody was concerned. Oh my God, the construct of virginity just drives me absolutely crazy. I think it is such a bizarre thing. Why is that a thing? It's the craziest thing to me. But nobody was concerned about any of that in our household. And certainly, I'm also really off-put by these men that are oh my God, my daughter has gotten to be a teenager, get her to a nunnery, that kind of thing. Or I can't believe she's going to one day have a boyfriend. And all of this gross angsting about their daughters having some sort of sexual relationships. I'm you want your daughters to have positive sexual relationships. What is this weird puritanical grossness? Obviously, I've gotten up a little bit on a soapbox there about that. But I had a father who did not do that. There was zero ways. He always liked any boyfriend I ever had. There wasn't any kind of emphasis about sex, but it certainly was something that was just kind of out in the open and something that they trusted us to be smart about. I remember having pretty good sex education, not pleasure education, but I definitely understood what was happening. And very importantly, I always took for granted that I would have birth control. It would come to me easily. And in fact, it did when I became sexually active. My mom, I'll never forget, we were driving down Middlefield Avenue and she's like, "Do you think it's time to start thinking about birth control?" And I was like, "Yeah, I do." And she's like, "Okay." And so we went to Patty Baldwin, who is still my functional medicine doctor. And I was on the pill. It was, like, there was no question in my mind about whether or not that was going to be a difficult thing to achieve. And it was hugely important for me, as opposed to someone like Kate Chopin or someone like Annie Ernaux, who literally did not have access to birth control, that it's hugely important that I was born in 69. The pill, I think, was developed in 63 or something. I never questioned whether or not I would have successful birth control, which is, it's monumental. It's really, really important to think about that. I really was convinced that I would have control over pregnancy, and that is very freeing, obviously, in terms of sexual experiences. I also wrote a book in 2008. It's called Hump, True Tales of Sex After Kids. It was a book about keeping your sex life alive after you have small children, or like when you have small children in the house. It was very much about like someone's desire and how, in fact, you might be able to keep that alive even when you're like not sleeping and you have small children like all over your body and your body is like doing all sorts of crazy things. But I do think it's an important data point here because I really do believe in the power of sex, and I believe in sex as being very positive, and I believe that it should be a priority in relationships. And I really think that the way that we don't talk about it is kind of weird. I understand why we don't talk about it, certainly, and I understand why it's a very private affair, but I really like the idea of being more open in ways that are comfortable about female desire, about the struggles, and also about ways that people can have happier sex lives. Okay, we're now going to finally get to the part where we are going to talk about Sally Rooney and Intermezzo. So here's the agenda in terms of our discussion of the book. The first thing we're going to talk about is the likability of the book, particularly about the ways in which Sally Rooney does a really good job with sex writing. We are then going to talk about Peter and Naomi, who are the first age gap relationship. We're then going to talk about Ivan and Margaret, who are the second age gap relationship. We're going to end actually on a note that's fairly misogynistic, which is kind of a bummer, but also I think justifiable and kind of unavoidable. So those of you who are longtime Fox Page listeners know that I am not someone who really loves the prose of Sally Rooney. I was very interested in this book because of the content, and I'm glad that I read it. And what happened is I realized that some of the things that I found kind of alienating in the other books were not as present here. And that was a very nice surprise. So there were things that I really liked about the novel, and I'm going to move through them pretty quickly. I do like the sophistication of her prose in general. I'm going to give a little shout out here to a book club that's a bunch of young men in New York City. They call their book club Tales on Tap. They read a book and then they go to like a bar that's coordinated with the book, which I think is excellent. And they've read some kind of heavyweight stuff. They read John Williams's Stoner, which is a really interesting book. They've read, of course, some Kurt Vonnegut because that's important for young men. But I was very impressed that they were reading this book by Sally Rooney. I have to say, though, I was impressed for just like a hot second. And then I was like, oh my God, you guys, wow, you're in for kind of a doozy. And I think by the end of the lecture, you will understand what I mean. One of those young men in particular had such a hard time with the fact that Sally Rooney does not use quotation marks. This is something that I don't even see anymore. I don't even pay attention to. I think in a lot of, like literary fiction, people eschew the quotation marks for a number of different reasons. So James Joyce, who obviously is also Irish and who is just an absolute pioneer of modernist literature, he was one of these people who started not using the quotation marks and used instead a dash or would just sort of not use any punctuation marks at all. And I think in Joyce, it has everything to do with pointing out that all of this is a fiction. The dialogue is not any more fictitious than the rest of what you are serving. Part of me thinks that Sally Rooney is kind of like a descendant of James Joyce because obviously she is incredibly Irish. And some of the reversals, some of the syntax in the book not only felt very Irish to me, but was weirdly kind of reminiscent of Samuel Beckett, who is another very important, very cutting-edge, avant-garde, experimental writer. So I would see these echoes and I appreciated them. It was driving crazy some of those young men who were reading the book. There's lots of fragmentary stuff, especially in the Peter sections. And I wasn't bothered by that. I noted it. I think for Peter as a character, that kind of fragmentary syntax is actually very appropriate. He's someone who is like really on the verge of a breakdown the whole time. He's often drunk. He's often high. He's super stressed the whole entire time. So this idea of not having cogent, well-developed declarative sentences is actually, I think, very appropriate and was very meaningful. I didn't even really note those things, but those were issues that came up when I was briefly talking with these young men. So those of you who happen to have listened to the lecture before know that the two main things that make it difficult for me to really love Sally Rooney was that her narrators often have a certain distance from the reader. So this happens because there would be a certain withholding of information. There's kind of a thing in writing. I mean, often you will withhold information because there's a reason to be withholding information. But I found again and again that her narrators they're often multiple. She uses a close third narration almost always, which is what we have also in Intermezzo. So you're entering into the minds of these people, or at least you're getting very close to the minds of these people. And when you have a narrator who does that, you have to have a very good reason for withholding information. And often she wouldn't. It's a little hard to think about this when we don't have the text in front of us, but it really bothered me because it felt sort of manipulative. The other thing that happened in her other novels, I read Beautiful World, Where Are You, and Conversations with Friends, is that there would be all these extraneous details. And I think some people really like that. There's one point in this book where, like they said, the train arrived at 8:52, and I was like, oh my God, extraneous detail, which was kind of a relief, because in the last book, I was like, what is this avalanche of detail? Those of you who are writers out there, and also all of you readers, you need to think of details as like a rock, which sounds very strange. But if your reader is wearing a backpack and your reader is, walking along through the story, every detail that they come across is like a rock that they're going to put in their backpack. It's helping them kind of form an idea of whatever it is, the place or the story or the person that they are reading about. And every single detail should actually be significant. If not, your reader is like weighed down by all of these details and also starts losing track of which one of these details is important. And certainly readers have argued that lots of detail is important for building a world or fleshing out a character, and I absolutely agree. But the details need to be working hard. They cannot be just random extraneous things, or else your reader feels, bogged down at best and actually kind of manipulated at worst. So the idea of this close third-person narrator is a perfect segue into an important element that I really liked about the book. One is that this close third-person narrator allowed us to be sort of in the perspective, the point of view of different characters. Peter is one of those characters, Ivan is one of those characters, and Margaret is one of those characters. We learn about Naomi and Sylvia and the mother, Christine, but we never hear the story sort of from their perspective. I loved the fact that Margaret was included. It seems obvious that you would have the two brothers because they're the ones who are grieving their father's death and engaging in these age gap relationships. But the fact that we hear from Margaret, I think, is excellent. I really enjoyed the idea that the older woman here, she doesn't exactly have a voice. It's not like I did this and I did that. But we definitely get close to what she is feeling. And the idea of having her perspective and having the older woman being the only female perspective was something I really liked. So I've alluded to these age gap relationships. This was so good for my thesis, and it's the reason why we are looking at this book first. Sally Rooney is offering up here two age gap relationships that allow us to kind of compare the one to the other kind of in real time, if you will, and in the same context. It's almost like a twin study, where you've got these two very similar people, although Ivan and Peter are very, very different people. But they're the same in the sense that they're both men. They've both grown up as sons of an immigrant father. I think the father's an immigrant. Maybe he's second generation, but Kubek is their last name. I think they're from Poland, and there is a certain sense that they don't belong in Ireland quite the way everyone else does. So both of them are male. Both of them are bright. They actually look very similar to each other. They both have very ambivalent relationships with their mother. They're both grieving their father. So all of that stuff is fairly consistent. Peter is 32 years old, and he is dating someone who is 22 years old. Ivan is 22 years old, and he is dating Margaret, who is 36. So what's interesting to me is this is really the whole point. Like, the book has to do with grief, and it has to do with chess a tiny bit. I mean, kind of barely, despite what the cover might lead you to believe. Even more curious for me, frankly, is the title. I mean, Intermezzo is like a bridge. It's like in a piece of music, it's the bridge that would sort of connect two different parts. And I didn't get it. I was like, there's some nuances I think that you could read into it, certainly. But every time Peter, who's the 32-year-old lawyer, like every time he would be listening to some concerto or some sort of classical music, I was like, really? I don't get it. This person is not gelling for me. And then to put so much weight on this idea of music and sort of a bridge. I mean, the obvious thing here is that like it's bridging the age gap or bridging the brothers, or that there isn't a bridge between them, or, the bridge to the father because he's died is kaput. Oh my God. I don't even know why that came to my mind. But by the same argument, like there is an intermezzo is like connecting two things. So it's, I mean, I don't know. I didn't love it as a title. The cover art really did not anything for me. I'm kind of forgetting that this is the part where I'm supposed to be telling you why I liked the book. So I'm going to get back to that. What I really liked about this is that these age gap relationships, not only like were they like these excellent parallels, so we can really dive into the double standard here, but they're also really the whole point of the book. I mean, Margaret and her sexuality, the older woman with the younger man, that's like really one of the most important strains throughout the book. So I really liked the idea of Sally Rooney exploring this. I also really loved the depiction of mothers in the book. Christine, as with all the moms in Sally Rooney, there's a lot of ambivalence, and Christine just killed me. I mean, she's like not a great mom in lots of different ways, and she got remarried and neglected her boys, and there are all sorts of reasons to not like her. I think it's funny that Peter always refers to her as Christine, not mom. But kind of in the same way that I love Succession or White Lotus and all these things where people are behaving badly, I'm always fascinated by these moms who really are shirking their responsibility. I think it's kind of a wish fulfillment thing. Like, I'm like, wow, that'd be crazy to be a mom and just like not care, which is actually a little overstated. But still, I really enjoyed the character of Christine, even though I think she was certainly not exemplary in the maternity department. I also really loved the depiction of physical pain. So we have this character, Sylvia, in the book, and it's this major plot point, which drove me absolutely insane, and we're going to get to why it did not work for me. But I really liked the depiction of physical pain. Part of that, you guys, is because the kidney saga continues. Those of you who have been listening know that I had this birth defect that finally became a problem, and I had surgery in January to correct it, and it failed. The surgery failed. So I have to redo the surgery, and I'm actually in quite a bit of discomfort, which has actually been revelatory. I mean, let me tell you, people, when you're like at the bank or something, and people, who goes to the bank anymore? Let me think of a better example. When you are getting your coffee and someone in front of you is like moving really slowly or like whatever, or seems like they're kind of out of it, you should just think to yourself, maybe that person is in a lot of pain right now. Being uncomfortable a lot of the time has made me so much more compassionate. It also has made me realize that you need to advocate for yourself when you are in pain, especially women, and especially when you're in the hospital and a lot of pain relief is available to you. Also, quick public service announcement. When you get a hospital bill, if you are appalled at the hospital bill and you are also like, wait a minute, how come my insurance is not covering this? The trick is to ask for an itemized bill. Once they itemize everything, often that number gets like hugely reduced because they realize, I mean, I don't even know exactly the mechanics of the whole thing, but something to keep in mind. If you have an outrageous hospital bill, ask for an itemized invoice. So I liked the depiction of pain. I thought the depiction of grief was also good. I kind of kept losing track of the fact that they're supposed to be grieving, which I think was not a great piece of the story. But I did like the way that both of them had these kind of complex relationships with the fact that their father had died recently. I also like the sibling age gap. My younger sister is 9.5, almost 10 years younger than I am. And we are incredibly close. Like when I went to college, she was 8 years old. You know, we've had this, it's a very interesting thing to look at this kind of age gap in families. And I think, I mean, this is kind of an extreme one, and happily it does not at all resemble my family. But I think it's an interesting aspect of the book, and certainly in these very large Irish Catholic families where you would have siblings who are much, much older, and where you would have a big age gap. It was nice to have this kind of third age gap in kind of a low-key, interesting way. Okay, another aspect that we're going to actually dive into a little more deeply, and one that I think Sally Rooney does very well, and she did it in conversations with friends also, is the sex writing. I think the sex writing is excellent. There is an adage that I learned, during my 3/4 of an MFA program at Bennington College, which is that when you are writing sex, the best way to do it is simply to say what is happening, describe what is going on. I think it is really not great to get lost in all sorts of metaphors and all sorts of similes and all sorts of figurative language when you were talking about sex. There's quite a bit of that in PLAYWORLD, which we are going to get to soon, and I think which really detracted in some ways from those scenes. But Sally Rooney is really good at this, and we're going to take a look at just one of the scenes that's kind of indicative of the sex writing and why it is good. And I mean, this goes without saying, but like if you're in a car with small children or something, I'm not sure you want to have this blasting over the speaker, but I mean, up to you. It's not crazy explicit, but like it's a sex scene. Okay, on page 50, and this is a sex scene between Margaret and Ivan. The sheets of the bed feel cold, maybe damp, or maybe just very cold. He unbuttons her cardigan, her blouse, and she helps him to unhook the clasp of her bra. He can feel himself sweating. his underarms, his forehead, a hot feeling. With her mouth, she finds his mouth, and they kiss once more. Her right breast is in his left hand, her nipple raised under the tip of his thumb, hard, touching. She lets out a little breath, almost into his mouth, a little sigh, as if she likes to be touched that way. So this is exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, you've got a hand on a breast, you've got a nipple. Like, I think it's very good to just simply describe what's happening. I'm not sure we need the right breast, left hand thing, although that doesn't really bother me. I like the fact that we're talking about a cardigan. I like the unbuttoning. I like the sort of groundedness of this. And also, again, just this description of literally what is happening. We're going to go on. So after this idea, and I like the idea, I mean, I'm not really sure about she lets out a little breath, almost into his mouth, a little sigh. I mean, I guess that's fine. It's very hard sometimes to analyze exactly why these aspects of, I think why sex writing can get to me sometimes is it ends up feeling so kind of saccharine or kind of like cheeseball, or I don't know. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. And for the most part, she does it well. So we have this idea. I liked this part about this sigh that Margaret makes. Lets out. Oh my God. And then, so we have a little sigh as if she likes to be touched that way. So I like this. This is all from Ivan's perspective, and he is young. He's 22. She's 36. And then we have this incisive next sentence, which I really liked also. Who can explain such a thing, and why even try to explain an understanding shared between two people? So I like that. This is right in the middle of the paragraph, and we're going to keep reading, and she's going to keep talking about what is physically happening in the bed. I loved the part about the sheets being cold and that maybe they're damp or maybe just cold, because you know exactly what that feels like. It's a very common experience also to have a cardigan on. I like the way that this is very grounded in common experience and also in things that are not sexy, like freezing cold, damp sheets are not sexy. And so much of sex is not sexy, which is, that seems so weird, but it's not kind of sexy, or erotic or whatever. It's just awkward or strange or uncomfortable or, whatever. A lot of the writing in Miranda July does a very good job of showing that. This kind of the awkwardness and the kind of weird goofiness of a lot of sexual experiences. So after that kind of philosophical sentence, the paragraph goes on, and she's going to continue to explain. I don't mind the contradiction, though. I think we're just underscoring the fact that it's difficult to articulate these things, and yet she is trying. Her breath warm on his lips when she sighs, and when he kisses her again, a muted sound from her throat. He moves his fingers to her zip, and she lets him, lifts her hips from the mattress to help him take off her skirt. Lying on her back now, she's wearing only a pair of black briefs. You're really beautiful, he says. Obviously. I presume people tell you that all the time. She gives a kind of laugh, shrugging her shoulders. Well, no, she says, but then I don't do things like this a lot. So I like the idea of her lifting her hips. There's a certain kind of nice pace to this, and it's kind of the mechanics of the whole thing. I like the black briefs. I like the details that we are getting here. And then I really like the dialogue. My friend in Tales on Tap might not like the fact that there are no quotation marks, but that did not detract from me. So we have this kind of sweet but kind of awkward conversation. This goes without saying, I hope, at this point in your Foxed Page experience, but all dialogue should be doing lots and lots of different things. And first and foremost, in many ways, it should be developing the character. And this kind of sweetness and the slight awkwardness here and the graciousness and kind of self-deprecating comment on the part of Ivan, then kind of combined with this kind of sweet self-deprecating part on Margaret, it's really helping us understand who these people are. It's also, in some ways, doing the thing that dialogue should also do, which is moving the plot forward, in a very small way, showing us, the conflict in the scene. It's doing all sorts of good work. So I think it's very excellent. We then have a couple of things that are firmly from Ivan's perspective, and these are more general, but I also liked them. A certain feeling rises inside him when she says this. Like a pleasurable form of anxiety, a strange, anxious anticipation of pleasure. So sometimes it's difficult to have that kind of more theoretical description of what's going on, but this is very good. And I like the idea of the anxious anticipation of pleasure. I think all of that is very effective. All in all, the sex writing, I think, in this book is excellent because she is doing that thing where she's just describing what's happening, but she's including really good details when she does it, and they're details that are grounding us. And then she's also having these kind of more, higher level abstract theoretical things, but that are also really adding effectively to the scene. Okay, now that we've taken a look at the sex writing in general, we're going to dive into the first of these age gap relationships. I just, for whatever reason, I'm noticing my outfit. Those of you on the YouTube can see that I am wearing, it's like a little knit t-shirt. Sure enough, I knit it myself. I don't even know how I did this cute square collar. Like, it's such a mystery to me. Those of you who are listening on the podcast, it's blue and gray horizontal stripes. It's a little knit t-shirt. But for some reason, the collar is like a little square. You probably didn't even notice it until now. I was just admiring it myself, and then also thinking how funny it would be. You know, I sometimes try to coordinate my outfit with whatever the topic is, which I could have worn my like Irish fisherman's knit sweater here, which actually would have gone very well with the idea of all the repression and inhibition where sex is concerned in Intermezzo, but I did not. But when I was thinking about female desire and like my outfit, there was happily no part of me that was like, oh, maybe I should, you know, dress with female sexual desire in mind, which I don't even know what that would look like. But I am enjoying yet another one of my home knits. Okay, so we're going to dive into this idea of Peter and Naomi and Sylvia. We're not going to look closely at the text except for one small part. I'm just going to talk more kind of generally about them. I liked the character of Naomi. Interestingly, in PLAYWORLD by Adam Ross, which we're going to look at next, the woman who is in one of the sexual relationships is also Naomi, which I just thought was so interesting. Naomi, it's not a name that I love, and it's very much like in the ether these days. So, but I really like Naomi as a character. She's 22 years old. Peter is 32 years old. He is a lawyer. Notably, she is in college. So she's 22 years, but she's in college. And maybe that's really typical in Ireland. But my sense is that like maybe some editor said to Sally Rooney, like, put her in college or something. Like, she needs to seem much younger than Peter. Because I think in many ways, the like 32-year-old dude with the 22-year-old woman is not like that shocking. I had the same reaction to the braces that Ivan is wearing. The braces just bugged me. I was like, we don't need the braces to keep reminding us that he's young. He's 22 years old and he has braces, which, fine. I actually had braces when I was 30, which is a whole other story. I had baby teeth at that point. That was not great. I was also pregnant. Really, like, not one of my better, spans. But I was so bothered by these braces because to me, it seemed like such an obvious way, just like Naomi still being in college. I was like, you have to trust your reader to understand that he's young. We don't have to have like these awkward braces at every turn reminding us that he is a young person. Both of those seemed like contrived to me, like she had to kind of add them in order to convince the reader that these age gaps were really significant. It drove me a little bit crazy. But Naomi in general is a character I really like. She's someone who's very strong. She's strong at the beginning. She's strong through the end. Peter talks about how she really seems to have everything figured out, which is interesting because she's totally broke and she's basically homeless. But she's someone who's also very resourceful and someone who is very confident in herself. I mean, you could argue that those things are not true, but that is how I read her. And I think there is a lot of data on the page that shows that she is someone who really has her act together. Quite a bit is made of the fact that she is taking pictures and is maybe doing some sex work, taking pictures in the sense that I don't know if it's like a fans only kind of a thing, or I don't know if she's selling, images of herself, or I don't know what exactly she is doing with her body, but she is using her body as a resource in order to make money, which, a lot of people can be judgy about that, but, she's using one of her assets to keep herself afloat while she is in college. She seems to have no support from anyone in her family. But right from the start, she is someone who is emotionally much stronger than Peter. And right from the beginning, you get this sense that she really knows herself much better and that this younger generation is just like in every way is kind of like stronger and more resilient, certainly than Peter himself. And what's important here, too, is that she's like that throughout the entire book. In the end, I'm assuming that you've read it. If you haven't, just like plug your ears and go la 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 or something. But in the end, things really work out well for her. Like this is a very triumphant book in many ways for our young 22-year-old Naomi. And not just in that like she's somehow like in a weird nubile way, like manages to like snag the older dude and like gets like she's like a gold digger or something. It's not that. She's someone who really is redeeming Peter and supporting him in a way that I think is very meaningful and really speaks to her strength. One of the things that I did not love about the depiction of her, though, which is kind of a big thing, was the depiction of sex. When we have sex between Ivan and Margaret, it is described in quite a bit of detail. We see quite a bit of the two of them having sex together. That is not the case so much with Peter and Naomi. There's a lot of him like looking at her and like really enjoying like some little crop top she's wearing while she's sitting on a counter, which it was a little off-putting because it felt like it was objectifying and kind of weirdly like distancing himself and making her more of an object. But the thing that really bothered me is that the novel portrays her as someone who has these like bizarre sexual desires. In fact, at one point, pretty well into the novel, we're on page 128 here, Peter says he wishes that he had a nice, normal girl, someone without bizarre sexual proclivities. So then we have the description of the sex. So this is, again, page 150 and 151. And this is not only a good indication of more of her sex writing, but it's an indication of the way that Peter's mind works. So it's very fragmentary because we're very close to his point of view, and almost all of the prose that comes from his point of view is very fragmentary. So we have this. He moves his hand down over her jaw, her throat, heat of her body under his palm. Gets on top of her, and she opens her mouth to be again kissed. Taste of her tongue, her soft passivity, deep. Closing her eyes as if ashamed, she says, just use me, just do whatever you want. You can hurt me, it doesn't matter. Inside her now slowly, very deep and tight until she cries out. This was confusing to me, and you definitely don't want your sex scenes to be confusing. Literally have in the margin orgasm ? Like, it's not clear to me if he's like actually hurting her or if this is like a sexual fantasy and, you know, she's like having an orgasm. So that's not great that that's not clear. So it's not great, obviously, here that it's as if, you know, she's closing her eyes as if with shame, and that she's saying you can do anything to me and you can even hurt me. This is a book that has so much to do with shame. There is so much shame on the part of all of the men, all of the women. The word comes up again and again, which obviously is something that is not great in my opinion, because all of the sexual experience for all of the people involved in this book is just like saturated with shame. I think that most of the characters in this book have a lot of shame where sex is concerned. But again, Naomi is this kind of strong character in every other way. And then a little further down, she whispers, "Is it okay?" So docile she always gets and anxious. He smooths her hair back from her cheek, kisses her lips. "It's good," he says, "don't worry." When he moves inside her, she cries out again. So there again, I was like, is that good? But then we have this raw, almost wailing sound, which that's obviously not good. And then we have this, "Oh God," she says, "thank you." So what really bothers me about the depiction of Naomi, though, is we have this person who I read as being very strong in many ways. I mean, some of you, I'm sure, did not read her in that way. But when we have her in sexual situations, she is someone who really doesn't have any power when they are actually having sex. And it's important to remember it's from his point of view. And he reads all of this as this kind of sexual depravity, which drives me crazy in some ways because it doesn't exactly fit. But honestly, like, I mean, this is a hot take, but if I were Naomi and I were dating Peter, and yes, he's a like successful-ish lawyer, he also is a hot mess. So maybe in some ways you would want him to seem a little more commanding and a little more in control. I also think there is so much fantasy. I mean, Baby Girl, which I have not watched yet, but the Nicole Kidman thing, the whole entire thing is that she has this desire to be humiliated. She's someone who is very successful and wants a man to have control over her. Like, I don't think that's like a bizarre sexual proclivity. The other thing about Peter and Naomi that drove me absolutely crazy is Peter's relationship with Sylvia. So Sylvia is his old lover. They had like this absolutely perfect relationship, you know, in quotation marks. And there's all sorts of rhetoric about how like they would be perfect and how like important she is to their family and how like their relationship would have been this absolutely perfect thing, which is such an odd concept. I mean, what relationship is absolutely perfect? It gets to be sort of romanticized in this crazy way. But the whole storyline with her is that Sylvia, because of some accident, is in a lot of pain, but more importantly, she cannot have penetrative sex. This drove me crazy. So he's in love with her, she's in love with him, and the fact that they cannot have penetrative sex is like the whole entire thing. The whole book turns on this, not the whole book, but their whole storyline turns on the fact that she's like, I can never give you what you want, and he's like, oh my God, I can never have what I want, whatever. It bothered me so much. I mean, I think in this day and age, we know that there are lots of different ways to have sex. There's, you know, whatever, mutual masturbation. There are all sorts of different ways that people can be satisfied. Penetrative sex is just like, it's just like the one thing. It's just like that one thing. Also, like, it's just vaginal penetrative sex. I can't even say that expression, not because I'm embarrassed, but just because there are a lot of consonants in there. But it drove me crazy. I was like, if these people are so in love, to put that much emphasis on the one thing, the one like single sex act, just seemed so limited to me in a way that just drove me absolutely insane. Okay, now we're going to move on to the other and perhaps more remarkable age gap relationship, which is the relationship between Ivan and Margaret. He is 22 years old. She is 36. I really appreciated the way that Sally Rooney gave me like almost identical ages so that we can really point out the difference here. I also, again, really like the fact that we hear Margaret's voice. What I did not love is that she is so ashamed. I mean, from the very beginning, this is like the worst thing that she could possibly do. And I was like, why? Why? So to get more specific, Margaret is separated from her husband. He sounds like a terrible, terrible husband who has issues with alcohol use disorder. She stood by him for a long time, although she is totally vilified, which I also didn't love that, of course. Her mother somehow like seems to think that she should stay with this alcoholic husband. They are not divorced, which is notable. I mean, and I think honestly, this feels like another thing that Rooney had to like kind of put in the novel to make it a little racier, because it's, I mean, for a lot of readers, it is not that racy to have a 36-year-old single woman be in a relationship with a totally consenting 22-year-old man. Like, I don't see the scandal here. I don't see the problem. I don't see the shame. It might be somewhat unusual, but like good for her. So I think in part this idea that she's separated from the husband gives her permission in many ways, permission, you know, that Rooney is creating for her to have the relationship so it doesn't become some kind of predatory thing. But also then somebody's like, but wait, make them not divorced. I don't know. I always think it's an editor who's like, wait a second, this is not like kind of racy enough. Let's make her not divorced so that, you know, especially in a Catholic country, that will be like a point for readers to kind of latch onto and be like, well, but she's a married woman, you know, who's having this relationship. But it absolutely drove me crazy. These are two totally consenting adults. They're both single. They really like each other. They seem to really like have like a lot of depth in the relationship. They're supportive of one another. It's not simply, you know, a sexual thing, which also that would be totally fine with me. But I just could not stand where we are hearing her voice that like she's doing something that is so terrible. So I'm going to read a couple of quick sections. And honestly, I might just like go crazy here with how bothered I was. So on page 49, this is like the page before the one where I was describing like the right breast and the left hand or whatever that was. So this is that same kind of, it's their first sexual experience together. And literally from the jump, there's all sorts of like shame involved for her. So on page 49, we have this. Then he kisses her again. It is, of course, a desperately embarrassing situation. Literally in my marginalia, I'm like, why? With like 1,000 question marks. A situation which seems to render her entire life meaningless. Then I have a bunch of exclamation marks. I'm like, what? Why is a sexual relationship with a consenting, young, hot dude rendering her life meaningless? Like, I just was like, there is a complete disconnect here. We're going on. Her professional life, 8 years of marriage, whatever she believes about her personal values, everything. I mean, maybe this is like what happens if you grew up in an Irish Catholic country. Like maybe it is that scandalous. But even then, like, I don't know. So then we move on and I was like starting to get more hopeful because she says this. And yet, accepting the premise, allowing life to mean nothing for a moment, doesn't it simply feel good to be in the arms of this person? So part of me was like, okay, good. Like, at least we're talking about feeling good. But then the premise is that nothing means anything. So like, what? Like, this is just not logically making any sense to me. Feeling that he wants her, that all evening he has been looking at her and desiring her, isn't it pleasurable? To embody the kind of woman he believed he couldn't have. To incorporate that woman into herself and allow him to have her. Okay, so she totally had me for a little bit there. This idea about being someone who is powerful because she is desired, that is so great. If you haven't seen the movie Shiva Baby, you should really, really watch that. There's an important thing in there about sex and about how powerful it can make women feel. So, but back to the section. Pressed against her, his body is thin and tensed and shivering. And what if life is just a collection of essentially unrelated experiences? Why does one thing have to follow meaningfully from another? So I get that. I mean, that's like kind of fine, I guess. But like, why all this emphasis on the shame and how this is undermining her whole entire life? And like, maybe it's okay as long as it's just this one experience that has nothing to do with anything else. It was such a notable way to kick this whole thing off. So, as you can imagine, this came early in the book, and I was like, all right, okay, I'm not loving the place where we are starting, but, hopefully throughout the course of this long book, it's 452 pages long, which frankly did feel long to me. I was like, okay, we've got 400 pages here for her, to have like a nice, tidy, satisfying character arc where she is going to become empowered. And honestly, like it kind of happens in the sense of like plot-wise what happens in the book. So that's satisfying. But throughout the entire thing, there is so much shame. It's like this giant, terrible thing that she is doing throughout the entire book. And it just drove me insane. Okay, we're going to look at 54 of 55. This is when she is thinking about things the next day. She's sort of like reflecting on the reason like why he might have chosen her. Chosen her. I mean, again, like what is this rhetoric? Okay. She's not bad looking, so they say, not old yet, no longer really married. And then she failed to put up the resistance he seemed to expect. I'm like, why? Why would he expect resistance? Like, why are they not consenting adults who are both excited to have sex with each other? Like, why would anyone put up resistance? It's so odd. Then we go on. Her lack of resistance, so unusual, fascinated and stirred him. I'm like, what? Why? Why is everybody resisting this? It just was like, just didn't make sense to me. A little further down, he was very nice to her in bed, she remembers. So nice that it's difficult for her, even now, to regret completely the whole ludicrous episode. What? Like, I just am like, why is it a ludicrous episode? Why does she want to forget it? And why does she have so much regret about it? Also, like the fact that he was nice to her in bed really undermines any kind of power and any kind of like real pleasure. Like she's so plagued by regret and doubt, which maybe is, I mean, this is maybe entirely realistic. Sure, I grant you that. But it is not making a compelling, optimistic, strong argument about women's sexual desire. It's like it's setting up to do that, and then it's undermining the idea that someone who is 36 years old, which is clearly not menopausal. We're not even talking about a 55-year-old woman here or a 45-year-old woman. 36-year-old woman here should be entirely capable of having like a delightful, empowering, satisfying sexual experience with someone who's 22 years old. Okay, we're going to move to page 57. Importantly, this is the end of the chapter of Margaret's first chapter, and it is the end of kind of their sexual experience together. And I will say that the end of this part like ended on somewhat of an optimistic / hopeful note for me, and I enjoyed that. But it was still undermined by all kinds of inhibition. So on 57, we have this. She has been contained before, contained and directed by the trappings of ordinary life. Now she no longer feels contained or directed by these forces. No longer directed by anything at all. Life has slipped free of its netting. She can do very strange things now. She can find herself a very strange person. Young men can invite her into holiday cottages for sexual reasons. It means nothing. That isn't true. It means something, but the meaning is unfamiliar. So part of me was like, empowered, literally that's what it says in the marginalia, empowered with some question marks, because it says she can do very strange things now. But like, why strange? I would like all of it is ambivalent. So it's like we have a sense that she might be empowered, but not really. Also, the idea that young men can invite her into holiday cottages. I mean, I guess she's invited, but also like, why isn't she like entering the cottage with him? Like, why is she needing to be invited by him? I suppose you could say that like there has to be a lot of consent because he's the younger person, which I mean, sure. And certainly everyone is consenting here. But it really is sort of undercutting this idea of sexual potency that we really would like to see in her. And the other thing is this entire paragraph is predicated on the idea that this is fine because it means nothing. Like, why is that? I mean, this should be something that's exciting and empowering for her. There was a part where she says he doesn't understand that in the future, she's going to be much older and he's going to be much younger. And sure, I mean, maybe that's an issue. Maybe that's something to think about. She mentioned she won't be able to give him children. Fine. But like, she's not marrying the guy. And even if she wanted to, I have a cousin who has always been with a woman who is, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years older. They are some of the most happy people I know. I mean, I just think it's crazy. So we end with a somewhat optimistic note, but then we move on to this on page 99. This is interesting to me because she's waiting for him at the bus and is kind of imagining what other people will think. There's a lot of concern in this book about what other people will think, which, I mean, fine, I guess so, but it's much less interesting to me in some ways. I don't know. Okay. Moving on page 99. Right at that very moment, of course, the Sligo bus, I don't know if it's Sligo or Sligo, the Sligo bus would pull up, and probably only one solitary person would alight. A more suggestive scenario Margaret struggles to imagine. Worse than suggestive, sordid. Why? Why is it sordid that she's waiting for her boyfriend, or not even a boyfriend, she's waiting for, a young man that she's having sexual relations with? Worse than suggestive, sordid. And she can't imagine a more suggestive scenario. I mean, I just was like, what? Then we go on. She, an older woman approaching middle age, again, she's 36, is waiting in her dusty, overheated car in a poorly lit car park for the arrival of a young man, hardly past adolescence, on a night bus from Dublin. Not even the kindliest, most trusting and well-intentioned of passers-by, observing the scene, could conceive of a wholly innocent explanation for these events. Why does it have to be innocent? Okay, moving on. The sexual element would simply leap forth with explanatory power. Fine. I mean, God, I don't mean to be interjecting between every single sentence. I can just hardly contain myself. Then we move on. And inevitably, people would come to hear about it. Her mother, Anna, the gang at work, even Ricky, or that's her estranged husband. And what would he say, she thinks, if he knew? Would he laugh to see her humiliating herself like this? I mean, again, I'm like, why is she humiliating herself? She should actually be really proud. I mean, maybe not really proud. I understand it's a complicated situation for her. But it just was infuriating to me that we're putting forth this model of an older woman having a relationship with a younger man and having it so fraught and having it feel so humiliating. Literally, she herself is feeling humiliated. Then a little further down, she's talking about her estranged husband. Or maybe in confusion, bewildered, he would refuse to accept the truth. After all, despite everything, he still believes in her decency, which she too believed in once, her own decency, a rag to clutch at amid the squalor of their life. I mean, the message here is that she is humiliated and that she is not a decent person anymore. It was so shocking to me that it was so boldly stated, this shame and this humiliation and this sense that she was no longer a decent person. I just found it pretty astounding. We're going to read two more quick snippets. Importantly, the mothers in this book, both Christine, who's the mother of the two boys, but also the mother of Margaret, in some ways they have a lot of power because they really are judging the younger children and not the younger children, they're judging all of their adult children. And again, I really like these maternal characters because they have a certain amount of power and because they're kind of a stand-in for society. It's interesting to me the way that she is constructing that. But again and again, we have Margaret's mother thinking that she's some sort of crazy wanton trollop. It just drives me crazy. I mean, and frankly, it'd be fine if her mother thought that as long as Margaret herself did not. It'd be very interesting and frankly very logical and predictable in some ways if the mother thought that and Margaret did not. So here we have on page 395, which, note you, is very close to the end of the novel. Part of what I'm doing here is showing you that Margaret is not going to go through some sort of trajectory where she is going to feel empowered at the end. In fact, she is going to align almost entirely with her mother's disparagement of her. So on 395, we have this. I also am reading in my marginalia here Beckett, so this maybe has some shadows of Samuel Beckett. Okay. She did spend years giving out, acting the part of the long-suffering wife, the persecuted saint. Years of her life, forced now to confess herself, after all, another humble sinner. I mean, why? Why is she a sinner? Motivated not by conscience, but by her own selfishness, and the worst, most vulgar form of selfishness at that, which is desire. A shameful thing, the sexual motive, in a woman especially. So in some ways, I mean, I could have a character in a book articulating all of this, and it would be very interesting to me, but this seems like such a strange thing to be promoting. I mean, I suppose you could argue that Sally Rooney here is giving us a picture of a character named Margaret who's 36 years old, who's sort of subject to a society that is saddling her with all sorts of terrible sexual inhibition and humiliation and self-loathing and shame. I think you could imagine that. And maybe this is a comment on, the Irish culture in general. I don't know. Maybe it's a comment on the patriarchy, but this idea that women's sexual desire is literally the most vulgar form of selfishness and a shameful thing. It's shocking to me. If Sally Rooney's point in this whole thing is that we are supposed to be shocked by how shameful everybody feels, then, the book is succeeding. I don't actually think that's what she's trying to do. We have a character who has a voice, a character who seems competent, and in some ways is really providing a lot of ballast and a lot of gravitas in this book. And yet this is this woman who is really allowing herself to be denigrated and is self-denigrating at every turn. So the last thing we're going to look at in terms of Margaret and Ivan, I haven't even really talked about Ivan other than his braces, but I think that's kind of appropriate. Ivan is a 22-year-old guy who is grieving his father and who is trying to figure out what he's going to do with his life and how chess is going to fit in. And his relationship with Margaret is consequential, certainly, but he's sort of at the beginning of his adulthood, and in many ways the relationship is more consequential for Margaret. So we're going to look on page 407, the last part of Margaret's section in the book, her kind of last word in the novel is the following. And importantly, things end on an optimistic note for them. And I really did appreciate that. He sort of convinces her that it's okay, which I'm also like, oh my God, why does he have to convince her that it's okay? And why does it have to be this monogamous thing where they're going to be together forever? And is she going to be able to give him children, blah, blah, blah. Notably, she doesn't already have children, which is an important plot point. Sometimes when I see that kind of a thing in a book, I'm like, okay, well, it's important. That was an important element that just sort of happens to be the case. It would have been a much more complicated book in some ways if she'd been a mother. But why am I saying that? Why would it have been more complicated? See, this is some cultural conditioning that has made me think that if she is a single mother, that she shouldn't be having sex with a 22-year-old man. Why? Why am I thinking that? Oh my God, the patriarchy, Okay, this is kind of the last thing that we hear from her. And maybe it won't last. Maybe next month or next year, Ivan will meet someone else, a girl, young and slender with long fair hair, and Margaret will have to let him go after all. To bear that, the pain, the embarrassment, caught out again, making a show of herself, serves herself right. I'm like, why? First of all, why are we glorifying this young girl? Also, why is it that, Margaret will have to let him leave and maybe she's going to meet someone? I was just infuriated that this was kind of the last note we were giving to Margaret. It goes on. Or in 10 years' time, against the odds, they might look back and laugh together. Maybe. Sense of all the windows and doors of her life flung open, everything exposed to the light and air. Which, that sounds kind of positive. Nothing protected, nothing left to be protected anymore. That is not positive. She's now just totally vulnerable and nothing can be protected anymore. Also, why does she need to be protected, The last sentence is this. A wild woman, her mother had called her, a shocking piece of work. And so she is, Lord have mercy. Oh my gosh, you guys. In some ways, I feel like I'm putting it on too thick, but I am just reading, the sentences that are in this book. Margaret literally at the end, using her mother's own disparaging words, she's really internalized whatever this preceding generation is thinking. A shocking piece of work, and so she is, Lord have mercy. I just can't. Those of you on YouTube will notice a complete costume and hair change here. That is because the last couple of minutes of the audio from yesterday did not record. Frankly, I am surprised this doesn't happen more often. But I will say right now the same thing I said yesterday at the end, which is I kind of want to reverse everything I have said today and make the point that if Sally Rooney is writing a novel that is really going to hold up a mirror to the way that women feel about sexuality, maybe specifically in Ireland, or maybe a lot of women feel this way, which is why I felt it was important to give you my biography up at the front. If that is the point of the book, and she wants to provide consolation and community for those women, that is amazing. But my sense, and this is maybe my own agenda, is that the book would have been stronger if there had been some message somewhere along the line about empowerment. So when we are looking at these age gap relationships, I think there's an opportunity in 2025 to speak of the empowerment of women. And dare I say it, but especially by a female writer. I'll sort of end us where we began, which is that I really was interested first and foremost in this topic by Miranda July's All Fours, and I was so inspired by the depiction of female desire, especially older women's female desire in that book. I was very excited to see somewhat of the same things appear in Intermezzo, and frankly found something entirely different. The good news is I like the prose of this a bit more, but I simply couldn't get beyond some of the negativity of the depiction of women's sexuality in the book. So if you loved this book and you were expecting me to elucidate all the reasons why you loved it, I am sorry. And I am also sorry if I maybe changed your mind about the book. Probably people who love the book stopped listening a long time ago. But I hope that people who are interested in writing about sex and in the idea of age gap relationships, I hope that you will come back and you will tune in to hear about PLAYWORLD, Annie Ernaux's The Young Man, and Kate Chopin's The Awakening. Thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.